could go ahead and get started. My name is Jim Harper. I'm with the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems, and I want to welcome you to this first of 3 webinars. And to start off, we're going to have our 2 panelists introduce themselves and today's topic.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. I'm Sarah McCune. I'll introduce myself in a bit more detail in just a moment. But first, I want to give a welcome and just say thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. My colleague Kathy and I are very excited. We have the opportunity to work together a lot because of the synergies that exist between gender and nutrition. But this subject of integrating gender and nutrition into livestock research projects is an important one to us here at the Innovation Lab. And we put together this series of 3 webinars with the following in mind, that we start with a general introduction. So for some of you, the topics at the first half of this webinar will be an overview or a review for some of you, but looking at gender and nutrition just generally. And then what we aim to do in this first webinar is to look at the beginning of a project cycle. So when you're in the design phase of a project. During the second webinar, we will go deeper into data collection and analysis as the second phase of that research process, if you will. And then the third webinar will really focus on what to do if you've already designed a project, you're already collecting data, but you want to be thinking about how to affect gender and nutrition, that's really not too late to do so. So the third will look at framing or presenting results of a livestock research project so that it might still affect nutrition and gender. So that's the arc of the 3-part series. So today we're really looking at the design phase of integrating gender and nutrition into that design phase of livestock research projects. And with that, I'll introduce myself. So I am Sarah McCune. I'm leading the cross-cutting theme of human health and nutrition. And I'm here at the University of Florida. I'm a faculty member in environmental and global health. And within the cross-cutting theme, I work with my research assistant, Nick Diaz, who helped me put together the nutrition portion of this webinar.
Great. And I'm Kathy Culberson, and welcome to those of you who are attending our first webinar series. I am the Associate Director for International Agricultural Programs at the University of Florida, and I am also the Senior Gender Scientist on the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab, and delighted to be here. And our research assistant, Lacey Harris-Coble, is also here, and she's been very instrumental in helping to create this PowerPoint series. So we're delighted to have you here with us today. And we're going to talk just a little bit, for those of you who are not familiar with the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab, what this is. For those of you who are familiar with innovation labs, the USAID has 24 of these that are scattered throughout the United States and then partnered with a variety of countries and in-country partners. And we are one of those 24s based at the University of Florida, the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab. And we currently have over 22 different sub-award research projects in 8 different countries. And you can read these here on the screen. But the University of Florida is responsible for managing all of these projects, in addition to a lot of the other aspects of management with an innovation lab, based here in Gainesville, Florida. We have 4 specific areas of inquiry that are being followed in the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab, and these include production, food safety, enabling policies, and future systems. And with these, we have 3 cross-cutting themes. Gender being one of those, which I am responsible for, nutrition and human health, which is what Sarah's responsible for, and institutional capacity development, which a couple of our other colleagues are responsible for. But this is a very exciting lab, and we're delighted to be part of it. And let me show you a little graphic that basically kind of illustrates how we fit into the larger Feed the Future vision, which is essentially to reduce global poverty and hunger through the inclusive agricultural section. Basically, the livestock systems looks at how can we sustainably intensify smallholder livestock systems, specifically to improve human nutrition, health, and incomes. And if you look down to the orange blocks that are below this vision statement, you can see the 4 areas of inquiry that we have, starting with future systems, animal source food production and marketing, livestock disease management and food safety, and enabling policies for livestock. And running across all of these different areas of inquiry are our 3 cross-cutting themes: gender, human and institutional capacity development, human health, and nutrition. And all of these contribute to what we call research for development and basically improving capacity of different livestock systems. So the purpose of today's first webinar is to really look at ways that we can begin to think about the concepts of gender, nutrition, and how to integrate them into the project cycle and particularly into the design phase of when you're starting a project. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the basics associated with why this is important for those of you who may not have heard this before. And Sarah and I are very passionate about this, so if we get excited, you'll understand why. But I've been doing this for probably about 30 years now, so I'm really excited about it. But why should you integrate gender and nutrition? Sarah's going to talk for just a minute about a conceptual framework that really helps to illustrate that.
Yeah, so as Kathy said, Kathy leads the gender portion of the Livestock Innovation Lab, and I lead the health and human nutrition portion. But the two are really interchangeable. They're not interchangeable, but they're inextricably linked. You can't talk about gender without thinking about the nutritional impact, and you certainly can't think about integrating nutrition without taking gender considerations in. And so what you're looking at is a conceptual framework that I have worked with that I built by modifying the UNICEF nutritional framework. So for some of you that are familiar with nutrition, you'll recognize in the top three, the blue tiers, it looks very much like the classic 1980 nutritional framework, where nutrition is determined by proximate and distal determinants. And so you have those immediate causes of nutrition, such as dietary intake and disease. Sometimes that's called disease and health. But underneath that, we began to understand 20, 30 years ago, okay, it's not simply what people eat and how healthy they are that determines their nutrition. There are these underlying causes. And so food security and care and feeding practices, or sometimes those are just called care behaviors, and then the environment and health services are the underlying causes of those proximate determinants of disease. And while that framework has been elaborated and expanded upon many times, and you can look it up and see the different iterations, we go back to that core many, many times. But as I began working within the context of livestock holders, at the beginning pastoralists, and more through the former Innovation Lab and now this Innovation Lab, it became clear to me that when we think about livestock programming and livestock research, we have to think specifically about how does that context change that conception of the nutritional framework. And at its essence, it doesn't change, but there are pathways that become clear. And the three green arrows that you see articulated at the bottom of this are the three pathways that research time and time again have illustrated are the ones that take agriculture to nutritional outputs or nutritional impact. So those include food production. So people can produce the food that they eat, be that crops or animal source food from livestock. People have income generated from livestock, and that income may be used to purchase food, but it may also be used to purchase health services that render nutritional outcomes more positive. The third pathway is women's empowerment, and that, as you can see, the green arrows, smaller, like spaghetti arrows, coming off of the bigger arrows, are the ways you can see that women's empowerment actually affects the environment. It affects care and feeding practices, absolutely, but it also affects household food security. So women's empowerment is a cross-cutting theme, quite literally, through this whole framework. You can't conceptualize nutritional outputs without understanding all the ways that women's empowerment may foster that. Interestingly and importantly, we also have to think about the ways that these pathways in the context of livestock production may negatively affect nutrition. So you see the red arrows, and these can affect both the underlying causes of malnutrition as well as those immediate causes. So with animal production, be it through environmental enteric dysfunction, be it through contamination of the environment with manure on the landscape more, you can have negative impact of livestock on child health. That can be zoonotic infection, diarrheal disease, some of the most obvious. But the desire here is to capture the real interconnected nature of gender and nutrition when we are trying to improve nutrition as an outcome from the basis of livestock production, improving livestock production.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah's done a nice job of sort of laying the groundwork of the interconnections of nutrition and gender. But to make sure that all of us are on the same page, and normally, as I said, I do this in a very interactive workshop way, we're going to talk a little bit about some basic concepts around the term of gender. So let me have you advance the slide. Normally when I say do this particular exercise, we have a lot of interactive activities that go on here. But I want you to just think for a moment, each of you, about the terms sex and gender and what the differentiation might be between the two, and then we're going to talk about that for just a second. Because many times people confuse these two terms and they are very different. When we think about sex, and usually this is a topic that draws a lot of giggles in my workshops, we talk about the biological differences that we see between men and women. That generally people are born with either a double X chromosome or an XY chromosome, which differentiates them into either male or female. And we're born this way, that they're the same throughout the human race, and we don't generally see much difference associated with sex. Now, when we talk about gender, however, gender is a very different aspect. It basically refers to the socially given attributes, the roles, the activities, the responsibilities that are connected to being born either male or female into a given society. And depending on the society you're born into, will have tremendous influence on how strongly those gender stereotypes are emphasized. The thing to understand about gender, however, as it differentiates from sex, is that these behaviors are learned. They are potentially changeable over time, and they have wide variations within and between different cultures. So it's really important to understand when we think about the differentiation between the term sex and gender that you understand this differentiation.
Can I chime in, Kathy?
Please.
I think that one of the key elements in understanding, okay, so I understand the difference between sex and gender, is that if we're talking about integrating gender, the point that you've made here that it's mutable, it changes, is why we have to study it. So you may know a population, but you knew it 10 years ago. And just because you knew a population and you ran something there or you had an intervention doesn't mean you understand the gender dynamics today.
Correct, absolutely, because it is changeable. And so let me just talk for a few minutes about some of the other things that affect gender roles. As we mentioned, gender roles are dynamic. They change over time. Just think about intergenerational changes that have happened in your lifetime. They can differ by local context, which is why it's so critically important that you understand local context when you're doing research, particularly if it involves gender. They also can be shaped by ideological, religious, cultural, ethnic, economic, educational, numerous factors. So it's also important to take these into consideration when you are looking at social systems. It is also a key determinant when we look at gender roles of the distribution of resources and responsibilities between men and women. And frequently, particularly in the countries that we are working in the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab, these roles are unequal and inequitable, with the women being responsible for much more of the work and less of the income control and generation. We can also talk about gender being part of a livelihood system. And for those of you who are not familiar with this term, a livelihood system was originally coined, probably about 20 years ago by Diffett. And it looks at a number of different dimensions, including the following, to basically try to kind of give it a larger, more systemic picture of what we're trying to research. And if we look at these different attributes, we can look at them starting with the physical, which involves things along the lines of potentially land, machinery, livestock, infrastructure, things that are tangible. We can also look at the human aspects, which can involve labor, it can involve potentially net nutrition, education, health, other factors that influence the individuals. We can look at the social aspects, which could involve kinship networks, labor sharing, the ways that people interact with each other. We can look at the financial aspects, the formal, informal credit, savings, and particularly when we look at this from a gender perspective, we recognize that women are frequently less able to access and control credit and savings. And then we can also look at the natural aspects. In all of the countries that we work in the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab, we have serious issues around climate change, and particularly the effects on agriculture, the soil, the water, the air quality. These are all things that need to be considered when we look at a rural livelihood system, and gender is distinctly a part of all of these.
Yeah, and interestingly, you can look at each of these capitals or domains and think about, from a gendered perspective, how does a gendered perspective on physical assets affect nutrition? So you can begin to understand. I was thinking as you were talking, cell phones, the infrastructure, who has access to those physical to that physical capital begins to have impact downstream on things like health and nutrition.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Kathy. So Kathy gave us sort of an overview of these basic concepts, sex and gender. We're going to do the same thing now for nutrition before we launch into sort of the meat of this webinar. So this next slide has a lot of information on it, but bear with me. So the idea here is to give you an overview of what do we mean when we talk about malnutrition. And I think the first and most important piece of information that I give you is that when we talk about malnutrition within the context of the Livestock System Innovation Lab, we're really talking about undernutrition. So on the slide in front of you, the first 3 rows, wasting, stunting, and underweight, those are 3 different types of undernutrition. And in much of the global south and many of the countries, all of the countries that we work in as part of the Feed the Future initiative, these are all issues, right? This is undernutrition. The bottom row, you'll see overweight and obesity. I think just from a basic science standpoint, it's very important to understand that that is of orders of magnitude important form of malnutrition globally, right? And in many of the countries that we work in, it's starting to be an issue even in the context of undernutrition. So overnutrition is a form of malnutrition. It's not the subject that we're looking at today, and it's not the subject or the nutritional outcome that we're most interested within the context of the Livestock Innovation Lab. You also see micronutrient malnutrition and micronutrient related, so you can have deficiencies or related malnutrition. Those are very important deficiencies in specific vitamins, like vitamin A deficiency, or you can have vitamin C deficiency and get rickets. So there are very specific lines of micronutrient deficiencies that cause global both morbidity and mortality. But the top 3, wasting, stunting, and underweight, are really the ones that we focus on most often. And let me spend 1 minute sort of differentiating the 3 for you. We tend to most often within the lab look at stunting. So stunting is in the blue row, the second one on the screen. And stunting is measured by height for age. So you take anthropometric measurements, that's the word we use to describe taking weight and height of children, often on a length board rather than against a wall, because often you're talking children under 2, so you measure them laying down rather than standing up. But these anthropometric measurements combined with age allow us to get to generate a Z-score and compare that child's growth against a global standard. And so we're able to say that child is below 2 Z-scores against the standard, and therefore that child is stunted. So what is the difference in the Z-scores between stunting, wasting, and underweight? Stunting, the reason we look at stunting is that height is a cumulative measure. Height moves, it only increases. You don't have a child that shrinks, right? So unlike weight, which is a very fluid measure, in the context of a food crisis, you would see weight change. In the context of illness, you see weight change. My son was sick last fall and lost 25% of his body weight. You think about that can happen in 5 or 6 days to a child, makes it difficult to say how much of what we're seeing is a moment in time versus long-term effect. So what we're interested in the lab is really looking at stunting, long-term chronic malnutrition. And so you capture that with a height for age. Wasting is a really important measure because it looks at height for weight. One point to recognize as we move towards talking about data is that age data is sometimes hard to generate. Accurate age data is not always readily available. That's one reason that this metric becomes utilized and utilizable. But one of the really important things about wasting is this metric is associated with death. So all of them are associated with higher mortality, but kids who are wasted are dying often. And so we use this metric a lot in the context of food crises, where you're looking at shifts in weight as well as height, right? And then underweight is really exactly what it sounds like, a child who is lower weight than expected for their age. So I just wanted to give a brief overview, because one of the things you have to do in the design phase is decide what nutritional outcome am I interested in achieving. These are all nutritional outcomes of a child, but we'll talk later on that you can look at more upstream things like what are they eating, dietary diversity, are they consuming animal source food? Those are things that we can look at that are further upstream than these downstream real impact level metrics.
Great, thank you very much, sir. That definitely was a good grounding, I think, for both gender and nutrition. So now we are going to launch into the beginning of discussion around the project life cycle. And as we mentioned, this is the first of a three-part series, and we're going to focus particularly on the project design phase, which is the very first portion we're going to talk about. And when we talk about the project design phase, this is the first step in project development. And it involves really reflecting on the situation. Sometimes we call this a situation analysis or a needs assessment. And depending on the focus of the project, this could include secondary literature review and identifying tools that could assist with the next phase of the project cycle, which is data collection and analysis. Developing the tools that will be used in data collection also occurs at this stage. And this is very important to consider because it will basically feed into ultimately the data you collect and the information and the final results of the project. So these types of tools can either be from a qualitative perspective, things like focus groups, key informant interviews, or they could be quantitative, where we're actually collecting hard numbers and data, or they could be a combination of both, a mixed methods approach to doing research. This stage is very important because it helps to understand the context in which you are working, and it also helps you to understand the system in which the project will be collecting data. So we're going to move on and talk a little bit about the next phase, which is the second stage, the data collection and analysis. And our second webinar actually is going to focus on this pretty heavily. But the second stage involves, as I mentioned, data collection and analysis, and using the instruments that were selected or designed in the first phase. This stage could involve training local enumerators, and frequently does, and that's another whole discussion that we could talk about, and considers who the data is being collected from: man, woman, female child, male child, adolescents, elders. I mean, lots of different considerations at this point. Where the data is being collected: is it at the home? Is it in the public spaces? Do we need to consider the gender aspects of who we're collecting data from? What time of day are we collecting it? Are both men and women available? And when, among other things. Think about seasonality of agricultural systems. Who's available during those times? So this portion is also very important to consider when we're thinking about who, what, where, and when we collect data. It should align with the project's indicators, which ultimately will determine the project's impact. So that's another important consideration. If we move into the final aspect of the project cycle, we're looking at what we call framing and reporting. In other words, this basically involves interpreting the data results, writing the final report or publication, and this is the opportunity for you as a researcher and your research team to focus on what you want to provide to the public or to your funding agency. It helps you to basically look at the data that was collected and frame it in a way that depends on what your research question was and ultimately what you want that work to say to a larger audience. So it's a really important thing to think about. It's also an opportunity, if you've already done the research and data collection, to think about ways that you could reflect again. And potentially, if you haven't automatically introduced gender and nutrition, look at ways that you potentially could do that.
Can I tell a story, Kathy? So I have a colleague who is in the Department of Animal Sciences, and I had the opportunity to travel with him. And it was only being overseas and working in the context of the Livestock Innovation Lab after we met with the team at the embassy in country where we were working that we got in the car. And this light bulb just went off for him. And he said, this is broader impact. This is what all these funding agencies have been asking me as a microbiologist who works on animal health, who obviously is contributing to the basic science and understanding of livestock health. It was in that moment that he was hearing and understanding the desire of USAID in country to really make an impact on human nutrition from that basic livestock research. He said, this is broader impact. And I think that one of the things we hope to accomplish in this webinar series is the idea that you can be an animal scientist or a livestock researcher, and your work really can contribute to human nutritional outcomes, but you have to make that link. And part of it is not just the design and the data collection phase, but we dedicated that third webinar really because of a belief that it's like communication science. We've got to get the message of this science to the right people, whether it's for policy formation or otherwise.
Absolutely. And just a personal story. My first 15 years of my life, I was an animal scientist until I started going
You've
out.
recovered.
I recovered. Well, I always say people, I am a recovering animal scientist. But basically, when I first started going out in the field and doing international development work, that's when I saw the systems approach. And that's when I recognized that social systems are absolutely imperative for success of a project. And that's when I became a gender scientist. So we will move on to the next aspect of this webinar. Basically, when we start looking at the project cycle, we can start looking at ways in the project design phase where we can begin to introduce the concepts we've been talking in regards to gender. And this is an opportunity where we can really say, what are the specific questions that we need to ask to look at incorporating these into the data collection tools. And we're going to talk about this in detail using a project example in just a minute. But the results from the questions based on the gender lens that you put on will help you to be used in the analysis phase and will contribute to helping to frame the final report from a gender perspective. So this phase where you're really looking at things and thinking about the specific questions that need to be asked from a gender perspective are critical. And I know Sarah's going to say the same thing about nutrition.
Yeah, I mean, we've dedicated a whole slide to it, but it's basically the same thing. Next slide. It's the same idea that in order to integrate nutrition into the research context as a whole, we have to be thinking about it at each of these phases. There are certainly framing and ways that we can present a report on sort of more traditional animal science in that final phase, but there are things we can't do. If we haven't generated data through the design and data collection, if we haven't integrated nutrition at that design phase and collected the data that we want, obviously we can't analyze those data at the final moment because we simply don't have them. So thinking about it as far upstream as we can increases the possibilities of impact of the project.
Exactly. So project example. We're going to kind of manufacture one, but it is actually sort of vaguely based on a project that currently is in the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab. But if we look at a dairy project that is being designed to increase milk production and improve household nutrition in rural Africa, we can begin to think about how do we apply these concepts of gender and nutrition to the project design. So if we start looking at the first phase and we think about, okay, we want to integrate gender into this project. We want to look at the questions that we might need to ask or could potentially be asked to generate the gender questions. And some of these could be, basically, we could say, who benefits from this project? Is it male, adult female, children? Who are the recipients and the beneficiaries? How do they benefit from the project? In other words, are they receiving additional income? Are they receiving additional animal source food products? Is their nutrition going to improve? Who benefits and how do they benefit? And then we say, if we're looking at the family being the beneficiary, are all of the family members receiving equal benefits from this project? Or are certain family members receiving more benefits than others? This is where questions and interviews are absolutely critical. And in many instances, what you may need to do is to separate the males and females and ask this question separately, because in many places, the women will not feel comfortable speaking in front of the males, and or the males will manufacture responses. So it's
or just have different perspectives.
Or different
perspective on the same reality.
Exactly. So it's very important that you think about, do I need to interview sex separate or do this together? Another thing that you absolutely have to consider if we're introducing a project into a community or into a family is, how will this project affect the workload of all family members? If we look at an agricultural value chain, we look at the production aspects, and we look at where are men and women concentrated in the production aspects. In many instances, the woman will be heavily concentrated in the production aspects, and as we move downstream into the end of the value chain, or as to who's going to be selling the product or actually reaping the benefits from the product, it isn't going to necessarily be the woman. So it's very important to understand, if we're trying to impact all people's incomes and all family incomes equally, that we look at this particular question. The other thing that you really need to think about, again, with a project cycle, is when you start with a project design, you need to start with the end in mind. What is the final outcome that you want to see from this project, particularly if we're looking at it from a gender perspective? Are we increasing the income, for example, equally of both men and women? Are we equally increasing the access to animal source food products of both men and women? So it's really important that you think about the end of the project as you are doing the project design.
I want to underscore a couple of things that you said in terms of the importance of integrating gender early. Two thoughts that come to mind from recent projects of which the Livestock Innovation Lab is involved. One is that doing this sort of gender analysis, whether it's of a value chain or just the landscape, can change the way that you collect data. So with whom do we need to talk in order to get the information that we need? We had this experience with the PPR project and understanding that in some communities, women aren't going to know about livestock, where in others, if you don't talk to women, you're going to miss some of the information. So understanding that even in the singularity of a single research project, you may have to approach different ethnic groups or different communities differently to get the same information. Similarly, I think to underscore that gender nutrition link, in a separate project, we recently were looking at sort of chickens, and this is separate from the milk, but to demonstrate your point, that when we went in and were thinking about sort of what could we do to help minimize the potential negative impact of these chickens on health outcomes, one of the things that became clear is in that particular community, in that part of the world, once you cage chickens, they become, that infrastructure input takes them out of women's domain and they become male domain. And so you have to think about how the project itself may affect the gender dynamics. So you start out thinking you have a project that's really aimed at women's empowerment and targeting women, and at the end of it, you've rendered it something that is no longer culturally within the domain of women.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So to think about it along the same lines, what questions must we ask and what process do we go through to really effectively integrate nutrition into this project? Some of those questions are basic. Let's talk macro first. Have you hired a nutrition specialist? Not every project needs one, but let's face it, if you're a team of animal scientists and you're looking at milk production in the context of aiming to affect human nutrition at the end of the line, you might need a nutritionist to help you think through what data do we need, what is available to us within the context of what we're doing right now to affect it. So do you need a nutrition specialist? And if so, have you secured one? The second point, similarly, sort of macro level, does your research team demonstrate best practices? I know from my own experience, unfortunately, the reality of field work is sometimes you eat once a day and sometimes you eat millet. You know, that's not optimal either for the health of your team, but nor is it helpful in terms of what it mirrors. And as a public health practitioner, I'm always thinking about this in terms of my students and everything else, that we have to mirror the practices. We've got to walk the walk. We're going to talk parenting.
Good
yes.
parenting.
How does your project aim to affect human nutrition? So thinking about what is the pathway, going back to, is it through empowerment? Is it through production at the household level? Do you assume that what is produced will be consumed? Or is it sale? Is it increased incomes? So you may be working on a value chain, milk value chain, and looking at increasing milk production, but you may have no expectation of shifting milk consumption in the household. It's all about putting that milk on an open market where you increase revenue streams to the household and they can buy different products at a different level than they're able to. So thinking about what's the aim of the project in terms of how do you think increasing, let's say, cattle milk production within a household is going to affect children? And is it the children of the household? Is it the children of the generalizable community? You have to think through those pathways. Lastly, who are the people affected by the project? So are their incomes nutritionally affected directly, indirectly? And that's what I alluded to in the last statement, is there may be an expectation that the whole tide rises, right? That this isn't simply about the household dynamic of where that milk is produced. It may be that if we target X number of households within this community, there is enough milk put on the market that it changes the supply and demand function and prices drops and everybody has access to milk. So we have to think about indirectly and directly affected people, not just intra-household, men and women, but community level as well. One of the other pieces that's critical in terms of integrating both nutrition and gender at this phase of project design is the utilization of existing research. And I think we both feel really strongly about this, that a lot of this work has been done and there is no need to replicate those efforts. And we really want to both reduce redundancies, which reduces the time burden that we put on any participants that engage us within our research. But the other part is leveraging what's there to maximize where our investment is going. And I mean investment both financially, but also time. So where research has already been conducted on, for example, next slide, women's empowerment or nutritional status of children under 5, leveraging those existing data. This may, as the second bullet illustrates, eliminate your need to collect baseline data, or it may minimize it. We already have women's empowerment baseline data, so we're only going to collect dietary diversity baseline data. So looking at what's available and how you can build on that. Mm-hmm. And also that existing literature should underscore the gaps that exist. And I think this is really important when we work in an interdisciplinary context. Mm-hmm. We have to go back to the literature to understand what's not been done in animal, for example, animal science, but maybe we know it in nutrition. And that's where the collaboration is really key. Those gaps can often be filled by collaborative efforts. A nutritionist could say, oh, we've been doing this forever, but it's a gap within the animal science or the livestock research. Similarly, agricultural livestock research has known this forever, but the human nutrition community hasn't had this uptake. So I think that's a real potential value.
Yeah, absolutely,
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so if we go back and we look at an example that we're using of a dairy project in rural Africa, we look about how do we begin to think about data collection. Well, particularly if we're looking at this from a gender perspective, there are certain things that you need to consider if we're going to conduct a gender analysis of the dairy value chain, for example. So we basically look at some of these questions. Who does what along the dairy value chain? When do they do it? What are some of the constraints that we need to consider? What are some of the opportunities? Who has access and control of the resources that are needed for the production and marketing, transportation, income generation along the dairy value chain? And we're talking about this from a gender perspective. The male, the female, how can we begin to look at ways to make those access and control aspects more equitable? What are some of the constraints that women farmers face in realizing a fair share of the income or benefits? Is it strictly cultural, traditional? This is the way things have always been done. Do the women need to be based at the home and so they're not able to travel? What are some of the things that we need to consider that again would help us look at this particular project from a gender perspective? And who in the family consumes the milk if it's not sold? Who makes the decision about whether or not the milk is going to be consumed or is going to be sold? These are some questions that could conceivably be asked during basically the project design phase from a gender perspective, if we're looking at the project that we're talking about, which is a dairy value chain.
And as we shift to thinking about the nutritional nutrition analysis, I think it's really germane to underscore that gender analysis is contextualized. And you go back to one of your previous slides, Kathy, that gender is, I mean, the term that we use is the intersectionality of gender is really important. So understanding that gender dynamics differ by caste, by wealth category, by livelihood, even within the same context, mm-hmm. Those questions are going to be answered differently and have different implications, in my world, on nutrition, right? So when we look at the nutritional, again, we're planning for baseline data at this point. We're not actually doing it. But for that nutritional analysis, some of those questions are who eats what, when. So you see the relationship between the gender and the nutrition. Some of these questions are the same. Who has access and control over food resources? You can go a little bit further upstream and say animal resources. So understanding, as literature showed us, that animal ownership or co-ownership may determine use of animal byproducts. So when a woman owns or co-owns a goat, that may give her different power over and decision-making over those food resources, i.e. the milk from the goat. What validated tools and indices already exist? And we talk about this all the time. But there is often not a need to recreate a new index, right? So a food security index. What else? A dietary diversity score, understanding the value of ASF, as recent science is really, really emphasizing, understanding milk consumption, egg consumption, meat consumption. Those dynamics independent of dietary diversity can really tell you about a community. And what research team is needed. So again, back to a point we made earlier, you have to know the kind of information you want and the context you're working in order to put together the right research team.
Absolutely.
And failing to put the right research team together, and that includes gender balance. So how many women do you need to collect the data you need, including contingency plans, like what if she's sick, what if her child is sick, what do you do? But also languages. So what languages do you need your enumerators and your team to speak? So what's the research team composition? And there's, like I said, a gender dynamic to that. There may be an age dynamic. It's hugely variable. But these are the kind of questions that we want to ask ourselves in order to design the right project. Next slide. So as we begin to wrap up, I just want to go back to that example. And again, Kathy and I just said, let's just take an example of a milk project in sub-Saharan Africa that's aiming to affect nutrition. But you could have a milk project that's looking at mastitis infection. You could have a milk project that's looking at fodder and feed for cattle that are held at the household level. We are often looking at smallholder farmers. I should have said that from the beginning. But this is just a review of some possible activities that would fit into each of what we've articulated as sort of 4 points of intervention for integrating into the design phase. So those are integrating gender, integrating nutrition, utilizing existing research, and baseline data collection. And I think I won't read through these again because we've talked through each of the points, but these are just sort of a summary of examples, and I'm sure you can think of others as well. But that sort of wraps up the arc of what we wanted to cover today. So at this point, I think we will open it up for questions. And at the end, we'll give you an overview of what's coming next in the next 2 webinars, and a slide with some references, but let's leave it here for now.
Right. So we'll look to our chat room people to see if we have any questions that have come in. And as Jim has mentioned earlier, this entire presentation will be available both on Facebook and on the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab website. And as I mentioned, we are going to be doing a couple more coming up in the very near future, but we're just looking to see if we have any questions from some of our participants.
Yeah, so we encourage you to please type in your question here in the chat box. And the question will be answered directly on the camera. Maybe I can start with a question, just going back to the very beginning to clarify the difference between gender and sex, because it seems to always be confused. And maybe people will use the terms interchangeably. So how can we overcome that, the bias that we think people just tend to think that it's the same thing?
I encounter that almost daily, either in written documents or when people are speaking. And I think it's partly because the term sex has such an evil connotation that people don't want to use it. And so they don't use it.
They think gender is nicer.
They do. They absolutely do. And it's very interesting. I mean, I politely try to correct people. Say, there really is a difference. Let me help you to understand the difference. You have to do it politely because a lot of times people are offended by the experience. But I also try when I'm in workshops and at interactive opportunities to actually have fun with the terms. And we do a lot of role playing, a lot of demonstrations about what is the real difference between these two things so that people walk away and they understand.
Well, and I think honestly, it would be great, and language matters, and we need to help people use the right word. But more than that, it's how it limits you in terms of understanding the implications. So I think Jim's question is most relevant in the sense that it's the so what. I'm always interested in the so what question. So if someone thinks that integrating gender is about including women, then we got a big problem.
We have to talk.
Right? Because that's about women. Being a woman is about sex, right? But if somebody understands that integrating gender is not about including women, but about female and male roles, then I don't really care. I mean, I care that they get the word wrong, but it's much more about the so what, the implications of not understanding the difference in words that has implications.
It looks like
all right, so we have a question here from Emia Oppenheim. says, thank you, and I am interested in a point you made regarding how your intervention itself can impact gender roles, such as caging chickens. How can you navigate this point, and how are you doing so in the Caged project? Sarah?
So this is a specific question. Thank you for the question, Emia. It's something that we will work through. It's different in every context, right? So the idea that building out infrastructure moves something from a male to from a female to a male domain is not universal, right? So we will have to navigate that space. There are also thresholds. So this is where qualitative research is really important, right? If you have a survey and you ask people about, are chickens female, who controls chickens, who controls decision making around chickens, blah, 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 blah. And you have a question that says, how many chickens would a person have to have before it became a man's domain, if you understood that. My point is, a survey is not a useful research tool as compared to qualitative data, where you go in and you just talk to people, or you observe what's going on within the community. The point I'm trying to make to Emia's question is that there are thresholds. There are thresholds all over social science, right, that say this is when the scale tips and this becomes a man's domain. This is where, and especially in something as fluid as gender roles and dynamics. So part of our work is to find those thresholds. And the point I'm trying to make is that that's not really appropriate for survey data. That's much more appropriate for qualitative data. So in the study that she was asking about, we're doing a lot of formative work right now. That's ethnographic, qualitative work based on participant observation, key informant, informal, and semi-structured interviews. But those data become really important in understanding those nuances.
Absolutely.
All right, we have a few more questions. One was asking about, can I view this webinar again? And yes, certainly. It's being broadcast right now on Facebook Live. So it should be available immediately afterwards on our Facebook page. So if you search Facebook for Livestock Lab, you should find the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems, and you can look for it there. It will eventually also appear on our website. And let's now go to Sarah's question, her two-part question. What have been some of the aha moments from participants during a workshop when they begin to really understand the difference between sex and gender? And to continue getting a bit deeper, are there also some experiences from workshops when participants understand the so what of how their gender impacts their life experience and the experience of others?
Fabulous questions. Thank you so much for asking those, Sarah. I should just draw attention to the fact that I recently have been involved with a project called Ingenious. That was a USAID funded project called Integrating Gender and Nutrition into Agricultural Extension Systems. I encourage you to look at the website. We have absolutely scads of materials that we have created around this. But I'll just give you a couple examples of some workshops that I ran in Nepal and most recently in Honduras. This is actually quite an emotional question for a lot of folks, and particularly men, because most of the workshops that I run involve men. And many of these are extensionists and their staff that work in the fields regularly with communities. And we do a lot of interactive participatory exercises that involve role playing, where the men become women and the women become men. And for the first time in their lives, particularly for the men, they begin to understand the dynamics that are involved in what their wives, their daughters, their sisters do on a daily basis. And I had one man in Nepal after we got done with one of these exercises, because we always debrief. How did you feel? What did it feel like to be a man if you're a woman? What did it feel like to be a woman if you're a man? This guy actually started to cry. And he said, I never realized in my lifetime what my wife did. He said, now I do. And if we bring this to the second question, he said, I will now go home and help her more, which I thought was fabulous. But just thinking also to the second line of the question, we just got done doing a series of workshops in Honduras last year where we trained people all over the country. And then we went back and we did a follow-up 3 months later to talk to people about how are you using these materials? What impact has it had on your personal life as well as your professional life? And we had people give us examples that they've actually adapted the materials to use in their workplaces that were totally different than what we had intended. And I was excited about that. But it was more about some of the women that I worked with, that we had worked with on a number of different occasions, talked about, I now feel more empowered to be able to challenge things that are going on in my household.
Yeah.
And the men would say, I now understand more about what my wife and my daughters do. And if I have a daughter, or if I currently have a daughter, I want to make sure that she gets educated.
Yeah.
So there definitely have been.
And I think that
moments.
I think that for me in gender training, one of the most common threads is that you see people realize that it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
That for women to become empowered doesn't mean men relinquish power.
Exactly.
And I think that's an important piece.
Yeah.
I also think we'll talk more about this next week, but the activities, and particularly for me, and I think it's what you're alluding to too, is those daily activity calendar where you have men generate what does their day look like, what are their activities, and you have men generate a woman's day and what does her day look like, and then you have women do it separately. But that is where a lot of the aha moments for me come from, and they often come from men recognizing for the first time there is no leisure time, there is no break, there's no sitting and having tea in my wife's daily activity, and here's mine. So those are some, and it definitely works both ways.
Yeah, it's making the invisible visible, and then having an opportunity to debrief it. But it looks like we're getting some other great questions coming in.
Thanks for that question, Sarah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we have a good question on nutrition from Nadim. Is a 3 or 4 year lifetime project enough to assess nutrition impacts of the project activities?
Yeah, great question. Yes, absolutely is the answer. And then, of course, there's a caveat. So a 3 to 4 year project, as we all know, is not 3 to 4 years of data collection, right? So if you get baseline data within the first 6 months, you're lucky. And you're probably not going to be collecting data for the entire 2.5 to 3 other years, right? So you have to look at what your time frame really is. And if you're looking at a metric like stunting, it may not be long enough to see change, right? But there are ways, and that was what I was alluding to briefly. We can talk more about this next week when we talk about data collection. But the selection of your variable is really important. So instead of stunting, you might look at change in linear growth, right? Because that's looking at the same thing, but you're able to look at it in a shorter time period. Similarly, you can step back from that impact the outcome. So if your outcome variable is stunting, that's really what you want to affect, and you've got let's say a 2-year project, you could look at something like dietary diversity. So consumption changes. That's what we're often looking at in the context of animal or livestock research projects. That's what we're counting on, is changes in consumption patterns, whether it's because you're auto-consuming something that's produced at the household, or whether it's that you're purchasing different types of food. So if you monitor dietary diversity through a 24-hour food recall or through other metrics that can capture what people are eating or purchasing, what the food security scores are, those are more temporally appropriate indicators for a shorter project. So you certainly can look at nutritional impact. It's just going to be different.
Okay, we also had someone asking about how they can learn more. So I'm going to put up our email address, but let's also go to the question from Wellington, from Hillary in Kenya. Thanks for the presentation, very insightful. One question, what is your experience in strengthening capacity in the whole area of gender among biological scientists, and do you have any examples one to learn from?
Yes, thank you, Wellington. I would suggest that you write me individually, and we can talk about that in greater detail. I have done this a great deal. Partly the value of having been an animal scientist for 15 years is I kind of understand a little bit about the dynamics associated with being a biophysical scientist, but I also have been able to integrate it into gender. I've done many trainings associated with this. I'd be happy to talk to you individually and to point you in the direction of some of those. So appreciate the question.
Okay, and let's see, from Bernard, it says, this is Bernard Ulu from Hillary, also in Kenya. Dealing negatively with gender connotation issues in terms of feminism, can capacity building be a good answer to fulfilling the deficits, and what examples?
Yes, thank you, Bernard. That is a very interesting question. Yeah, definitely. The capacity building can be construed and conceived in a variety of different ways. And there are many instances when I go into workshops where people think, oh, you're just a feminist and you're going to talk about just making sure that you empower and strengthen women, and we don't talk about men except for to oppress men. We don't talk about it from that perspective because that's not.
We don't even believe that.
Yeah, we don't even believe that. That's not what gender equity is about. Gender equity is about equal opportunity for both sexes. And so it really is critical that people understand that as a conceptual framework before they begin to go in and try to do capacity building. But again, we have lots of great examples. I would strongly recommend that folks, and we'll put this up also as an available website, go and look at the website for Ingenious, the project I mentioned previously. We have developed, I can't even tell you how many different materials that are very interactive, very participatory about how to integrate gender into your work. They're in 5 different languages, so I want to encourage you if you need a different language, and we'll make sure that we put that website up.
So I also think back to the question, I mean, the two are related, the question about biological science and this. Through my postdoc, we worked on integrating gender into climate science, largely in Senegal, but also in Kenya and a couple other locations. And I think that one of the things that I found that worked really effectively when working with sort of classic basic scientists, so these were climatologists and climate scientists, is that the breakthrough moments there in terms of gender integration occurred when people saw that their own efforts, so if you take a climate scientist and what they're trying to do, and this was often in the context of climate information services, they were trying to get projections and climate information to farmers so that they could grow their crops, that they could plant at the right time, all of that. But once we were able to dispel the myth that it was a zero-sum game, so this was not about taking men's power and giving it to women. Once we were able to say, look, if we integrate gender effectively, you do your job better, like your job as defined by you. So if your goal is to get farmers planting to have higher crop yields, whatever your metric is at the end, once you begin speaking that language and allowing people to see that their own self-defined metrics of success are more likely to be achieved by gender integration, that's another space where you get that aha moment among basic scientists.
Absolutely.
All right, we're coming to the end of this 1-hour webinar, but it's not the end of the series. And I'll let our panelists explain that webinars 2 and 3 are coming soon.
Exactly. We have 2 more webinars coming up again to continue looking at the project life cycle. And so on June 13th, same time, same station, you can tune in again to look at the integration of gender nutrition into the data collection and analysis phase of the project life cycle. And then again on June 27th, again, same time, same station, we can look at the final aspects of framing and reporting in the project life cycle. And if you have any additional questions or want more information, you can see the website down below for the Livestock Lab. And we are delighted to have all of you attend. And
Spread the word.
And spread the word. We look forward to hearing from you or seeing you again in the future. But we will put up some of those websites that we mentioned, and we're delighted that you were able to join us.
Thank you so much.
And here you see the Ingenious.
Yes.
Someone was asking, Bernard was saying he was going to look it up, and here's the link and some other resources.
Excellent. Great.
Thank you everyone for your questions and for your attention. This is the conclusion of this webinar. But as mentioned, we look forward to seeing you at the next 2 in this series of 3 webinars from the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. Have a good day and a good evening.
Ciao.
Ciao.